Good morning. Welcome, everyone. So welcome again to all our speakers, and it's quite impressive for me to see you all. Okay, so let's start with the presentation of Dania Abdul Malak. And Dania is going to explain us the importance to create a governance model in the Mediterranean. Dania is the director of the European Topic Center at the University of Malaga in Spain. She's got over 15 years of experience in environmental assessment and management. Her work supports the implementation of different global and regional directives, such as the EU MSP, the EU Habitat Directive, the EU Biodiversity Strategy to 2020, the Barcelona Convention for the Protection of the Mediterranean Coastal and Marine Environment, and also the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. So the floor is yours, Dania.
Okay. So yes, thank you, Chantal and everyone. And I also agree that day one was quite rich, and today it has the same flavor, it seems. So I'm looking forward for sharing my knowledge, but also learn a lot from all of you. Yes, I was asked to be short. I would try to go through my slides in a way that will not take too much time, but of course, I guess we will have a time for question and answer in case we need to go in depth with any thing that you think is needed. Just to go a bit to the first day, where we had, as you mentioned, Chantal, quite some terminologies used, some thoughts discussed on one side, like what the policy side is of the questions, but also from the science side. So I think that what I will be going through is a little bit of a combination on how to move from evidence to try to change processes. Just to mention, my main messages will be starting from what I previously presented in the first webinar on the escalating human impacts and its effect on the ecological systems, to the situation of current policies and planning tools that don't necessarily reflect the nature of life on the sea and on the coast, and then what we are doing, part of the processes to experiment some transformation in the systems on how we govern in a way biodiversity, and the case in the Mediterranean. So these are like the main questions I will be taking you a bit in depth with. But I think that we need to set a bit now the context. I said it in the welcome on day one. I think that we are in a very important moment now to try to really embrace these changes, put them part of mechanisms. I think there's a momentum of the ocean decade. There are so many efforts being done regional, but also global on transformational changes, but also on restoration needs and prioritization. So I think we have so many angles that we could tackle these elements, especially in the Mediterranean, that it's much needed. So starting from this ecosystem-based management mechanisms, we need to ensure that they are somehow mainstreamed in the processes, but also that the criteria of transboundary governance is really set to support these different, I think, dimensions of what decision makers are struggling with. So one is to reduce the biodiversity loss. The second point is about climate change, so how to reduce the impact of climate change. And the third one, how to feed everyone. No? So I think these are the three challenges, and I think that these transboundary mechanisms are important for us to have in mind as a way forward to be able to really balance these different priorities. Anyway, so let's go to point one. I think it's, I just go back a bit with few images to recall what I mentioned in the first part of the training. So biodiversity is the foundation of anything we depend on. So it's the foundation of human well-being as well. It provides us with functions, with benefits. They need to be very well understood in order for them to be then transported somehow to managers at local level of natural resources, but also to decision makers and also to regional governors. No, so I think that's an example on Posidonia oceanica and this ecological cycle. So it's not only a plant that lives and is native to the Mediterranean, it's a hub of life. So everything that we see in that image in a way depends on its well-being. So for us to eat the fish or the shrimps that some policymakers would like to have on their plates, we need to have it. So it's really the foundation for providing habitat for important species for our food, but also to stabilize coastal dunes. So it has this link to the coast, but also it's important to the climate change issues that we're having. So it's really a very important sequester of carbon. So just taking that out of our system has consequences. And this is a fact. I mean, these things are happening. So with progress in humankind, we have gone into some cultural behaviors where indigenous approaches have been somehow living in harmony with nature, what we want to try now to have in our upcoming policies and targets, right? So there was a bit of a balance where humankind was coexisting with nature. Of course, that would have graphically effects on the amount of fish, on the amount of Posidonia, on the dunes, and so on, but there is still some harmony. But we are in a decade and we are moving every time more and more into overexploitation. And it's a red alarm for us because it's a direct threat, and science and evidence is showing. So it is a direct threat for our human well-being. So if the example of Posidonia was something that was a basis for many of the well-being we are living in or we used to live in, now this is something that is just not being there anymore in many cases. So that's a representation, at least to me, to my understanding of how this growth that is to me not very blue is looking into. So we are really harming the foundation of our lives. We are reducing the food that we have, and we are going into more and more growth. So that's a bit of an alarm that we are at a crossroad. There is clear indication that we need to do these shifts. So moving into the second part. So what is this situation of current policies and planning tools? So they don't necessarily reflect the nature, this transboundary nature, right, of sea life, but also of coastal area, of this land-sea interface questions that are very important. Why? Because as we see graphically as well, we try to capture how the different somehow frameworks, governance mechanisms, policies, policy instruments are somehow cutting partially or partializing or fragmenting the different territories that we look into. So now in that case, it's coastal and marine. So we have some policies that look into internal waters, while others, they look into territorial waters, while others go into international waters. But at the same time, they don't all look into the same direction. So we have some conceptual, but also institutional, but also sectoral and governance fragmentation in how we look into the ecosystems. There's no holistic way, or there's no integrated way of looking as a whole, as a system, but we fragment it. And this is affecting the way we use it and the way we manage it, right? So there is also lots of variability in our social and our cultural, but also economic context and system. This is also affecting. And I think the most threatening part is the unbalanced power, especially if we move from a framework between sectors or from a framework between countries. So there is always a dominance of some understandings on others and some actions on others. And here comes the importance of why we need to look into this transboundary way of governing when it comes at least to conservation, right? So we need to look beyond the borders. We need to have a spirit of compromise. I think these are like the important ingredients, as I mentioned to Chantal, in terms of the transboundary governance when we were preparing for that. So I think the way, and there are these mechanisms. I mean, the transboundary governance is a tool that is used in many cases, and it does not only affect protected areas, it goes beyond. And it is somehow a practical mechanism to overcome differences, these differences and this fragmentation that I informed you in the previous slide about. And mainly, it has a tool to encourage different type of cooperative works. So working areas are different, but the cooperation, I think, is the main element here to overcome sectors, to overcome boundaries, and to achieve shared goals. So I think the starting point is, what do we want to achieve as a group? And then we move forward, just overcoming these fragmented somehow elements that rule us, right? So this has proven in many places that it is an effective mechanism to address important issues that we have, that such as these cumulative impacts that come from very many sectors and several I mean, mainly from sectoral activities, but also from climate change impacts. And that's something that could be used across scales. It could go very local, and it could really be transboundary. So cooperation is at the heart, and cooperation can mean different things. So it could mean between different sectors or different areas, irregular communication, just informing each other about what is going to happen, sharing information, that I think it's a very strong basis for anything that is to be planned. Also to consultation mechanisms. Also, it can move and be more effective whenever coordinated actions are put in place. And even it could go into developing joint management planning and joint implementation of decisions. And I think today we will be hearing quite some interesting case studies where this has proved to function, or that is ongoing, but it is being challenging. So, at the heart of that, I think there are some compromises, right? And there needs to be an understanding that these multi-stakeholder, multi-country engagement, they would require considerations of co-benefits. So when you have something, you might need to lose something else, where different nations or stakeholders will need to weigh up each goal. So we put these common goals and we need to weigh what is more important than the other for us to reach that goal. So there are co-benefits and there are trade-offs, and this is something that needs to be at the starting or at the heart of such a mechanism, such a transboundary governance towards conservation. But also we don't need to lose the importance of paying clear attention to equity, to access to knowledge, to access to information, to access to be part, to engage in the decision making, and also to make sure that these decisions to protect, to conserve, are made in consultation, especially with affected and, more importantly, with vulnerable communities. So that goes finally always to the local communities. So out of this somehow scoping why this transboundary conservation governance is an important tool and should be somehow starting to be used as a mechanism to reach some common goals that the planet is putting for itself, and everybody's committing to these goals. It needs to start be put in practice, especially, I mean, in the case of the Mediterranean. I think it is an important tool to be taken a step further. And here I'm zooming into the work that we are trying to move forward in an initiative, the Mediterranean Biodiversity Protection Community. Since 2016, we started with the first phase of that initiative, and this is taking, the second phase is taking on now until 2022, where we have gone into prioritizing some areas where we could be testing these approaches, and we went into somehow pre-agreed bases, some elements that were already set on the table by the CBD, by the Convention on Biological Diversity, which are the EBSAs, and that's the ecologically and biologically significant areas. So there are 15 of them. It is a global somehow prioritization of areas that have that need special attention for the ecological sensitivity and biological sensitivity they have. And the Mediterranean, we have 15 EPSAs. These are, I mean, the criteria are there, they are unique. Why have they been selected? Because of their uniqueness and rarity, because they have threatened and endangered species, they have high vulnerability and fragility. They have high naturalness value, and they have high biological diversity, among others. You can visit, I just kept the website at the bottom for you to know more about that. The importance of these big areas, I think you can see it on the slide. It's that they have broad extent, so they take coastal but also pelagic habitats, so they are diverse in that sense. They have undergone a scientific but also a political consultative process, and they have been somehow selected based on some consensus, which is a very important starting point of how that could become a tool towards this transboundary conservation challenges. And of course, as you see, most of them cover more than one country. So the administrative borders is something to put on the table. And more importantly, I think using them as a basis is really important towards what we want to achieve by 2030, by 2050, these different visions, these different targets that are being set or have been set and affect the region. I mean, global, but also European targets, I think, are there, and they are affecting this region that we are in. So that has been a basis for us to look into as a way to engage stakeholders around the table from different countries on informally to try to attain global and regional conservation targets, but also restoration targets that are becoming more and more, I mean, a reality as we are overcoming the 2020 and starting the 2021 with some actions already and instruments being available. So we have focused in this activity on one EPSA, that's the SAIS EPSA, which is the South Adriatic Ionian Strait, ecological and biologically significant area. And here in the group of trainees, many of the trainees are part of this working group that is being moving forward with testing how we can use that as a mechanism to engage, to communicate, and to try to move forward a possible understanding and action plan to conserve such an area in a way among commitments between the different countries. So why this area? Because of its criteria. I mean, it has lots of cumulative pressures coming from activities, but also coming from climate change effects, being closed or a semi-closed nature. It makes it much hotter than the rest of the Mediterranean, but also it has these other pressures that are accumulating on that. It has important habitats and species that are of international and community importance. It has habitat sensitivity that is normally not represented in the current mechanisms put in place for conservation and for protection, which have a nature to be much more coastal, to be much more to the territorial waters of the countries, while this is a big area that has a little bit of a continuum, right? So it has a special ecological sensitivity, and it is important to be used as a pilot site because of its transboundary dimension, engaging different countries, but also areas beyond national jurisdictions. Even though this point, I think it's always a bit conflictive when we mention it. I think that's my final point. We have set already, as I mentioned, a working group, informal working group that has been working on that. That's the background image here is of a meeting that was held in Herceg-Novi to kick off somehow the process of how can we reach some common goals, what are different local actors, but also different types of stakeholders willing somehow to compromise for the well-being of the area. So initial discussions and surveys have been done. Some initial meetings have been done. We are envisaging a meeting this year and another meeting next year to move forward to try to see how far we can engage with that, commit to a level or to have it as a foundation, at least to exchange the knowledge and so on. That's my last slide. I see you, Chantal, trying to tell me to stop. So I just put the 3 points that we think that they are challenges that we would need somehow in a way to try to overcome and to find solutions to. And as usual, I mean, the starting points are to define responsibilities. It is not a very easy task. There would be disagreements that will remain over jurisdictions in the region, as in many other regions of the nation states, so the different dynamics in the region, the different roles of the different international institution frameworks in the Mediterranean. I think they need to be quite engaged in the process. So we have a representative of the Barcelona Convention here with us, but also I think the EU SAIR instrument is also present in the region. We have countries that depend on the EU and others that are in accession. So there are different dynamics that are somehow important to tackle. So here I open the question also for the floor and for the case studies afterwards. What is the potential role of the regional seed programs, for example? How can this motivate such further commitment in terms of transboundary conservation? We also have the question of uncertainty. So there are lots of uncertainty of how far we would go into the impacts and the aggression of the overexploitation in the region. So there is a climate crisis, that's a fact. Overexploitation of resources are being monitored and they are another fact, but also there is economic volatility is also increasing, border disputes, ocean grabbing. So how can the current networks that we have respond to encourage more cooperation, to go more into the thinking of trade-off? I think it's an important challenge also for that region, but also to others. And also the mandates. So there is a lack of statutory power and funding macro-regional agreements. They undermine in a way their effectiveness to bring together states. And I think that's an important issue. So how can these instruments really be used to put countries more into cooperation and coordinating their activities towards common goals? I think that's a very important element that needs to be a bit tackled, and I'm really happy to hear afterwards in the case studies whether there have been any best practices to overcome such limitations and somehow to engage with what we are trying to develop here as a case study in the Mediterranean. So there are some previous transboundary agreements in other places. What can we learn from them? Are there any best practices or solutions or ingredients that we can add to our work? I'm really happy to hear further, but also to engage with you with any question that you might have around what I presented so far. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Dania. You're actually perfectly on time.
That's
and I wasn't trying to stop you. Thanks a lot. It was really, I think, really interesting, very rich. We can see that it's a complex region, but it's also a very exciting place to work because there are lots of challenges. I guess COVID-19 is not helping also because, as we said on Monday, it's important to connect and to see each other and to talk and to sit around the table, understand our differences and work on our common issues. So it's surely a complex area, but also very rewarding when things work. So we have time now for a few questions. We will do the same as Monday. So first, whoever raises their hands, we will take your questions. Then we'll take questions in the chat. And if we don't have time, please write your questions in the chat because we'll have only a few minutes, and we'll make sure we get your question answered at the end of the training. You will receive a written document with all these different answers. So who would like to comment or who has questions on Dania's presentation?
Yeah, I'm trying to read through the chat. So I think that there was a question about the link to the EPSA. So that's solved.
Yeah, it was solved.
Yes, and there was the blue growth economy is a matter of terminology, but I very much agree that the concept of blue economy implies a morally.
Okay, so I have one actually. The tool you presented, I mean, I don't know if we can call it a tool at the end. It's how do you connect what you introduced to MSP, EBM? I mean, how is everything connected? Because I think that's the complexity. There are lots of different approaches also from the science that need basically to be put together and agree between themselves. So how does it work? How do you scientifically use all these different approaches to be able to come to a politician with a clear message?
So I think we are in the in a stage of defining what is priority and how to start somehow planning, right? So the MSP are there are plans. I think Andrea will be discussing that much more in depth because he's very much engaged in them. So there is a need to somehow define, prioritize, and agree on how to move forward with activities in a space. It happened on land quite some years ago, decades ago, and it did not go well. I think there are quite some important mistakes that were done and they should not be repeated. Now we are looking into the sea and looking at it as a big opportunity. This opportunity is sectoral, so there are interests in that, and it does not necessarily take somehow the underlying biology or the underlying ecology in consideration. And I think that's the starting point. I mean, there needs to be this evidence put on the table on the need to start from what the sensitivity of the environment or the area you are working on to define what can be done. So if you need to shift your maritime path to reach an area, you would need to shift it because of the sensitivity. So it's not the shortest, but you need to find ways that would be mainly what I'm mentioning with the trade-offs. So sometimes you would need to lose some advantages, in fishing because this fishing place is not the most adequate. Bottom trawling is a big issue. We know already that has huge effects on climate change. There is evidence on that. So bottom trawling is an activity that would need not to be taken on board. So I think all of these trade-offs, they need to take the sensitivity of the environment you're looking into as a basis. And then all the plans can be done. Of course, finally, it's about planning. But if you don't take the sensitivity of the environment, you're finally contributing to further biodiversity loss and more consequent effects and impacts on the biodiversity that is
I think Gaetano wants to comment also. Gaetano, you wanted to comment?
Yes, thank you, Chantal. And
thanks, Dania.
And many thanks to Dania, because I think she raised a number of very crucial points, especially in relation to the Mediterranean. I think
we cannot hear you very well, Gaetano.
I'm getting closer. So I was saying that I'm grateful to Dania for having raised a number of very good points that are relevant for the Mediterranean, but apply, I believe, to all the regional seas. And I think one point on the governance issue, that's the short comment I want to make. We spoke about fragmentation, which is indeed a huge challenge in working on the marine and coastal environment and planning, etc. And I think it's not only the fragmentation within the region, but it's also the fact that too often the global initiatives are very fragmented, in the sense that we have a global agreement on biodiversity, we have a global agreement on climate change, we have a global agreement, and I could continue with the full list. But at the regional level, we managed to go a little bit beyond that, and I'm talking now the case of the because we are entrusted by the government with the entire package. So while we work on pollution, we need to look at tourism. While we work on marine protected areas, we need to look at back to pollution and climate change. So what I'm trying to say is that we have a huge advantage at the regional level if we manage to, to build on it. That is to increase the integration of the approaches. But unfortunately, even at the regional level, too often there is fragmentation and there is not enough enforcement. And this is one crucial point. So my concluding remark on this point is that if we manage to better enforce the commitments that are made by governments at the global level, at the regional level, ensure their consistency, we will do a huge service for the region in getting intersectoral, in getting integrated, in opening up to dialogue and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaetano. Very, very interesting. I think this is really letting us feel that this morning is going to be a really interesting time to discuss on all these challenges. I see Audrey also wants to comment, and then I'm sorry, we will need to move on to Andrea's presentation.
Yes.
So Audrey, quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dania, for this very interesting talk. I was wondering, because, well, it's still linked to the previous discussion, how is exactly the boundaries of this EBSA position? And do you have a bias towards the marine resource that are exploited, or the users that depend on them, or how is it defined? Is it based only on biology? And then you see the link with marine functional connectivity, like can we contribute to that? Or do you also enter information from the uses of the marine resources and functions and services?
Yeah, so the process of the EBSA took place quite some years ago, and it is there, and it has been done, as I mentioned, with a consensus. So there were scientists that were prioritizing areas that are sensitive, biologically and ecologically speaking, and there were countries that committed to somehow define them. So this is already a fact. There is a consensus on that, and it is there. But of course, then what to do with these areas is rather on the countries to decide on, to put a management plan and to take these areas forward in their somehow multi-country planning. This is the basis of it. From there, what are the steps that have been taken place? Very little. I think there are very few EBSAs that have any action plan behind them, that have any agreements how to move into that. And that's, I think, a very interesting case of already an agreed transboundary area that could be a place where somehow, ecologically sound starting points could be taken. So there are no steps in that sense, and I think it's totally open to any formal or informal mechanisms to jump in and to try to reach certain goals, such as the ones we have. So we need, in a way, we have the 30x30 targets now. So there are also some restoration targets, how to reach a 30% protection of the Mediterranean. That's a big question. I mean, I think we are at around 7% of protection. That is not always real, as we know, but at least on paper, we are 7%. How are we reaching a 2030 target that all countries have committed to? So there, I think there's a very good starting ingredients to where to prioritize, to more strict protection, but also which are the uses among the countries that could be prioritized for less sensitive or less important areas. So I think the dynamic needs to start. We are trying with the pilot to move forward some informal discussions in that sense. And we see, I mean, I really would like to say that, we have the spirits high, and let's see how far that could go.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Dania and Audrey, for this. It's always frustrating to be here telling you we need to stop, because I really think the conversation could go on.